Hi, welcome to Rangle.io's Master the Key Tools. This is the third part of our Angular 2 webinar series. My name is Michael and I'm here with Igor. And
hello.
Between the two of us, we've got well over 20 years of JavaScript experience, and we're hoping to share some of that with you. So some of the key tools that you'll need to be successful with Angular 2 are using TypeScript and ECMAScript 6 for Angular 2 development, transpilation using TypeScript, Babel, TypeScript or Babel or other modern technologies, and then build tools like Webpack and other build systems. And we're going to talk about how that's affected our workflow. And then finally, we have a special talk about Batarangle, which is something we've been working on with Google for debugging Angular 2. So it's all very exciting. So first off, we'll just get into using TypeScript and ECMAScript 6 for Angular 2 development. I've been a little bit skeptical about ES6 features and to a certain extent TypeScript features myself, and more broadly speaking, even transpilers. But I've really come to love them, and I'm hoping we can share some of that with you and why I've come to love them. So before we get into the transpilation features, we'll just talk about some of the key ES6 features. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into all of them, but some of the key ones that are really handy when you're working with Angular 2. So one of the first ones, and this goes for other modern frameworks too, is ES6 template strings. It used to be that in JavaScript you would have, you had your single quote or double quote and it gave you the same sort of standard string. In ES6, they've actually expanded that. Now there's a backtick, and what that lets you do is write strings that have multiple lines in them. And additionally, it also lets you put in variables. So we could declare, this hello variable, which is going to have a classic string constant in it, or a string literal. And then we have an output variable that we've set up here. And then this little $sign squiggly syntax lets us actually embed these variables into our output string. And we can avoid all the concatenation with plus and whatnot, which made things like error messages and whatnot ugly. One thing to note with ES6 template strings, though, is when you do use new lines, they're sensitive to spaces and the actual new lines themselves. So if you put a new line in and you're just trying to stay within your line length limit for your linter or something, that will actually be a new line in the end string. So you do have to be a little bit aware of these things. Classes, they're a feature that a lot of people wanted. We've seen in modern frameworks, classes tend to be used to represent views. It's really important to remember with ES6 and TypeScript classes that under the hood, it's still prototypical inheritance. You still have all of the same classic JavaScript functionality with respect to this, so you do have to be quite cognizant of that. One of the nice features about classes, though, is that you can actually write methods without any sort of function, having to use the word function in order to declare your method. You can actually just describe these things by saying the name of whatever you want your method to be. And we've included constructor in this little example here because that's what your old constructor function in ES5 would be like. And constructor is a special method on every class in ES6 and TypeScript that is run when you make a new class. Arrow functions, they're another really nice feature. I was a little bit skeptical about how handy arrow functions would be for me, but then I noticed in some of my code that involves a lot of promise chains and whatnot, how the implicit return of arrows has been really, really nice. I mean, what we have here in this first line is a very contrived add 10 function. It takes one input parameter and it adds 10 to it. And we can see we have this really sort of nice mathematical way of describing functions. And there's no squiggly braces in this case. And this is the implicit return that I was talking to, where that x plus 10 gets returned as the result of the function. And arrow functions can also use classic squiggly blocks too, and you can do an add 5 just like this. And the important thing about arrow functions for use in classes and whatnot is that they do not set this or super or arguments actually. So you do have to be very cognizant if you are still using legacy code that has arguments that it won't work, and you do have to be. Well, you don't have to be aware now of this. It's actually quite handy because this will refer to the outer scope. So in methods, this is really quite nice stuff. On some of the TypeScript features that are really helpful with Angular 2, we have typed injection. And what this lets you do is avoid writing a lot of Angular 2 boilerplate. Angular 2 has a special decorator for injecting things. We see an example here in our constructor where we might want to get at something called an item list, and we could use add inject to do that. And I'll just let Igor run with this for a moment?
Yeah, so there is TypeScript, just to clarify again, if someone doesn't know, is a superset of ES6. Essentially, it has some ES7 features, but one of the nice things that it adds to the language is the idea of types, which are stripped at runtime. And there are several good use cases for types with TypeScript. I think Michael will show you the @inject one and how it made easier if you use TypeScript. But there are a variety of reasons why types could be beneficial to use in your Angular 2 application.
Just in general, I mean, I'm a big fan of types. They've saved me on past projects where I had a project, it had 100% coverage in terms of its spec files and whatnot, but there was a human error in one of the specs, and this was a connection pool library, so it was responsible for making sure that my node server could stay in touch with the database and only assign so many connections and then wait till it could get one. And there was a bug, and that bug actually cost real world money in terms of developer time to just keep a lid on it and whatnot. And then I converted the library to TypeScript, and I was able to find just one little bug, and that bug, it was worth it. I mean, just being able to save a developer and admin time. I mean, it's not a magic bullet. There are all sorts of cases where types won't necessarily help you, but I mean, just for that alone, I think it's totally worth it. And we'll take a little bit of a closer look at some of this typed injection stuff in a minute. TypeScript also offers constructor property shortcuts, which is a nice handy feature. So you could imagine if you're writing a class, you might want to pass some stuff into it and then assign those as properties for your class members. And so we have here my awesome component, and it's got a quantity property. And this is sort of a long-handed way of assigning it. In TypeScript, you can actually just put the accessibility modifier, public, or protected or private, depending on what your actual needs are, the name of the property, and it also happens to be the name of the parameter in the constructor, and its type. And behind the scenes, TypeScript will actually take this bottom form and turn it into the top form. So you can see there's a big savings in boilerplate there, and it becomes pretty nice to work with when you get used to it. TypeScript also brings to the table interfaces, and interfaces work kind of like classes, except that they're just instructions for the transpiler. So you don't actually get any JavaScript out of these interfaces, but you do get enforceable contracts that you can use to communicate with both the compiler and the other developers you're working with. And this is really handy for describing things like object literals.
Yeah, and one nice feature of TypeScript specifically is that its type system is structural. So the way I like to think about it is that if it fits, it sits, so to speak, and you can provide an interface for anything, for a function, for a class. You can mix them together with object literals, just like we do in the const A example at the bottom of the slide. And in general, they provide documentation for your code that otherwise would have to come in the form of comments and whatnot. And the beautiful thing, of course, is that all this information is stripped at runtime so that you don't increase the size of your executable, so to speak.
I mean, personally, I really like functions a lot. I find a function is usually what I need when I need some sort of programmatic tool. And one of the things that really drew me into TypeScript was the fact that I could type my functions with these interfaces, and then consumers of my functions would know. And this is not necessarily handy on like an API, but when you work with callbacks or higher order functions, it starts to become handy to know, hey, I've got this event object that I'm working with, and these are the parameters that it's going to give me in its callback. I mean, just being able to find those out through my tooling without having to go into the docs can save me enormous amounts of time, and I really like interfaces for that. So now that we've seen some of the features of ES6 and just some of the features of TypeScript, we're going to take a few minutes and talk about transpilation. Transpilation, it's a subset of the word compilation, so you're actually taking something from one language and compiling it into a different language. And then in the cases we're really concerned about are taking supersets of JavaScript like ES6 or TypeScript and then transpiling them into JavaScript that can run in every browser. So this little background image here is a picture of a very short, it's actually ES6, it's not even TypeScript, it's a little blurb of code that makes a variadic adder, and then on the right-hand side we see it translated into JavaScript.
Yeah, and the interesting thing to note here actually is if you look on the right side with the ES5 examples, it's actually quite humanly readable, and more importantly, it's similar to the type of code you would probably write yourself. For the most part, mind you, but nevertheless, it does produce a very readable output for the most part at the end of it.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I'm often reminded with these transpilations of like old school C programmers and how they'd look at assembler under the hood and know what it was talking about. And I feel like ES5 is almost like analogous to that.
The assembly of the web.
Yeah. So, and that doesn't even touch on, WebASM or any of those other technologies, but they're way out of scope for today. So, transpilation, it's like transposing in music, if anybody's familiar with that, where you can take a piece of work that was written for piano or something and then transpose it so it could be played on a guitar or a trumpet or something else. Well, it's the same kind of concept here. So we're just taking code that's written in something like TypeScript or ES6, or it could even be something more esoteric like CoffeeScript, and just transpiling it down into JavaScript that we can work with. Now, I was really skeptical about transpilation. I spent a lot of the last several years trying to write JavaScript code in such a way that my feedback loop was really short. Like I wanted to be able to just write my code, write it in JavaScript, and have the browser run that. And obviously, for production and deployment, you're going to do minifications and all these other kinds of things. But in development, I really, really liked having that access to raw JavaScript. And I was always very concerned, how am I going to get back to my source? How am I going to solve these common debugging issues? And then what about the configuration issues of dealing with a build system? And of course, this dates back to sort of when the first generation tools like Grunt, where you're writing all of these elaborate tasks to get your minification in and whatnot, and it's very easy to introduce errors and whatnot. And we've seen a lot of improvements. Modern transpiler solutions have solved most of these problems, and they've gotten it to the point where they're actually quite pleasurable to work with. I've really come to like it, and they're really nice to configure too. I used to have grunt files that brought in other dependencies and whatnot, and they'd end up being very, very long. And I mean, this went through when I switched to Gulp. I run into the same sort of problems where I have, several hundred lines, and with a tool like Webpack, I can do that in, 15 lines that are all just straight configuration. So there's a couple options for transpiling. We're going to be talking mostly about TypeScript transpilation today. The TypeScript compiler can actually take code that's either written in TypeScript or even in ES6 JavaScript as of 1.8 and transpile it into the JavaScript that we actually want to work with.
And even though we're talking about TypeScript, the steps for ES6 transpilation with Babel are very, very similar. The tools are essentially almost identical. You end up using the same thing with Webpack and whatnot. So the principles behind TypeScript transpilation are very similar in Babel as well. So I wouldn't necessarily view it as just a TypeScript specific thing. It's just something that you would go through if you were writing ES6 as well.
Yeah, and the tools, to Igor's point, are really nice. I mean, I've seen things like Mocha, where it will take either a Babel compiler, it actually has compiler options you can specify. So for those that don't know, Mocha is a popular sort of test runner that works with assertion libraries. And we use a lot of it here at Rangle when we're testing our code. And so Mocha will actually let you specify a transpiler. And you can even run Mocha transpilations in your tests with ES6 using Babel and TypeScript using TypeScript. I've ported projects like that before, and it's actually been quite nice. Some of the benefits of transpilation are that working with ES6 and TypeScript means you can write less code. You can write semantically clearer code that your colleagues are going to be able to spend more time reading and absorbing than trying to cut through the boilerplate. And making use of first-class modules that are available in TypeScript and ES6 is really, really nice. And then another added bonus, of course, is static analysis. And that speaks more to TypeScript, where you can actually have your programs and other programs reason more about your code and help you make it, tighter.
Yeah, and then most importantly also, it makes your code a lot more self-documenting. I think it's a point me and Michael touched on earlier. But I think that's one of the biggest selling points with using something like TypeScript, especially in an environment where you have a very large-scale application and multiple teams working together. I mean, it's just something that's hard to beat in terms of the documentation level that's provided out of the box, just by using this in your code.
Yeah, I couldn't really agree more. And I mean, modern tools mean never having to hit F5 again. And so with that being said, let's actually take a look at some of these tools here. So I've put together a really simple demo for this. Now, actually, backing up for a second, the Angular 2 team is working on a command line interface set of tools that have been inspired by other modern frameworks. And these tools are going to let you get your applications up and running and deal with scaffolding and other wonderful things like that. Now, these tools aren't quite ready yet, but at Rangle we've been working on a set of starter libraries for modern web development, and we have one for Angular 2, and it'll get you bootstrapped with everything you need to make a scalable application. Now this over here isn't quite that. What I have here is a very trimmed down version of the Rangle Angular starter that just has some stuff for us to actually play with in webinar form. And just to get things started, I'll start it up here. So npm run dev runs a Webpack tool behind the scenes, and this is a Webpack server that's actually going to, in real time, keep all of our code transpiled into into ES5 so it can run in any browser. And we can see over here in the top right, I've got a browser running, and I can run over to my example root here, and we have hello webinar, and there's 2 exclamations. So let's really shout this out. Hello webinar. And as soon as I hit right, we can see that Webpack is doing its thing in the bottom corner, and all of a sudden, without even having to hit F5, I get updates. And that's really, really nice. And it doesn't really end there, though. I mean, it just gets better. Another thing we can do here is take a look at our error console. So if I come down to my develop menu and show the error console, now, sorry about the window size here. So Angular is running in development mode. That's fine. This is all sort of normal. But what happens if I introduce an error, for example? Or actually, not even introduce an error. Let's just introduce a change first, and then we'll see what happens with an error. So changing it back to something a little bit more reasonable, 1 exclamation mark, we can see in our console output, well, no errors, because there aren't any, but I was actually hoping we get a little bit more insight from Webpack in that case, but that's all right.
I think the application works so well that there's just like no errors in this case. I think we should show the actual error happening probably in this case.
So what if we wanted to say something? We'll start with a very simple error, and we'll say like const my string, and we'll force it into a number, and then we'll say something like a. So this just doesn't make sense to TypeScript. It's still valid JavaScript, though. So what we should see here is everything's rebuilding, and you'll notice I haven't had to switch over to my my running command line instance of Webpack or anything like that. And I can see these errors, WDS, errors while compiling. And one nice thing about TypeScript is, scary types aside, it's actually really quite flexible and permissive. It will build JavaScript even if you have compile errors. So for people coming from languages with compiled backgrounds, it can be a bit odd to see compile errors and then still have a running product at the end. And that's sort of a testament to just how awesome JavaScript is these days. But what's really nice about Webpack is down here in this bottom corner now, we can see where this error is. And it's it's a type error, 3.7, and type string is not assignable to type number. And I can actually say 3.7, hey, wait, that's actually line 3.7. I haven't had to go anywhere or figure any weird mappings out. Like, it's just that automatic. So if we introduce a more severe error, like say something that just, this makes no sense, for example, well, okay, so lots of different problems that I've now introduced here. And I hit right. Now my editor is just really not having a good time with this, which is, it's good to see. It's always good to have linting in your editor. I mean, that's been true for the last several years, but it's really impressive how those tools have come along now too. And again, we see a world of errors now because I've put in like an incomplete quote, and I can go back to that very first one, and we see again line 3.6, and so it's pointing me right in the right direction. So this is great.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that's kind of nice about this whole setup is that with modern tools, like, again, you can use Sublime or Atom or Visual Code with whatnot, and you get the compile time errors right in your IDE while you're looking at code, right? Again, you see this in your console output with the setup, as well as if you just look at your terminal, you see those compile time errors. And essentially what this allows you to do is to switch less context. You're more often looking at the code than going between windows and so on. And this does speed up your time very much. Like, In this type of environment, I don't have my terminal running anymore. I just essentially have my IDE and a browser, and that's how I work in that setup. And it speeds things up a lot. And considering the fact that the code is self-documenting both for your own application code as well as any library that you use, like Angular 2 and whatnot, you get all the documentation in your IDE or editor of your choice, again, requiring you to switch contexts a lot less at this point.
Yeah, so I've had a really good experience with it, and to Igor's point, I mean, I end up running my NPM scripts just through my IDE, all through a graphical user interface, and that's pretty impressive for a guy like me who really likes his command line, that I've actually been able to move away from it in that sense. So
I think everyone in the JavaScript community really has a really strong appreciation for command line tools. And this is not necessarily, I think, taking away from that. I think it's just taking away from the mundane aspect of it, right? I mean, we still run commands in a command line very often and whatnot. It's just I don't need to do it on every build or recompile it.
Yeah, I mean, if it can cut down on me actually having to switch tasks or switch tabs or even reach for my mouse, those are valuable cycles that keep me in the context of actually developing my software instead of in the context of changing applications, so that's nice. We'll take a look at some of the actual ES6 and TypeScript features that we talked about earlier, and we'll see them in action now. So aside from having this really simple, flat example root, there's a couple other properties in here. So I've got this unique service. There's really nothing to it. It's injectable, and I mean, to find out more about injectable, you can look at, the Angular docs, or we actually have a book on Angular 2 that we've put together here at Rangle, and we'll share out a link for that in a few minutes. So we can dive into what that means outside the scope of this webinar, but let's just say for now this lets us take this unique class and inject it. There's really nothing fancy going on here. It's just got an ID function that will return a somewhat unique-ish ID. And so the first thing I need to do is actually tell Angular 2 about this, because it knows that it's going to be injectable, but it doesn't know where it's going to be injectable. Okay, so again, good tooling. We're going to see how to fix that typo in 1 second. I'm just going to fill this part in. Yeah, so this is actually looking in the entirely wrong folder, so we'll just pop in a dot, and that's that. My tools tell me everything is good. This hasn't really affected the application at all yet. So we're just using that because I have a supporting component over here which uses it, and all this guy does is bring in a unique ID and assign it to a property. And so we see here we've got this long form of property construction. We can't see it in action yet till we use it. So let's actually plug this in, and then we'll take an actual closer look at some of those components. So I'll put in my my quasi-random, which is where the Q comes from, and random. Okay, good. So we can type successfully, and then we'll just let our component know that this guy's out there for it. And here we're going to see an interesting feature. So we've got our multi-line strings in use here. Now these spaces, I kind of mentioned before, they're actually going to be in that string, so you do have to be aware of that. This is a template, and it's an Angular 2 template, so that's not really super urgent for us to worry about now. But let's plug in our component and see if we can actually get that unique ID, or somewhat unique ID, in there. Oh, okay, validated, and there we go. So we've got a unique ID, and we've got everything working. Now, let's take a look at actually using some of those features we talked about. So one of the things I talked about was that the constructor can automatically get rid of a lot of this boilerplate over here for us. Now I'll just get rid of that property, because you don't need to specify properties like that in ES6, but TypeScript is a little bit more diligent and it wants those sort of things. Actually, that's going to do weirdness. So what I'm going to do is slightly change it so that unique is a property of this. And if I went public u:unique, I would actually be able to, I'm going to keep that as a number, but I'll actually call it from this. And then we can see that this will actually compile. And I have a property called u on this class now. It's not necessarily what I want, but it'll actually does show that we can make new properties without getting type errors and without having to write everything out in sort of long form. One of the other things we looked at was how TypeScript will use this typing information. So it knows about the concept of a unique, and it can figure out behind the scenes that unique is a class it needs to pull in. But if we wanted to do this the long way, we bring in our special inject function, which is a decorator, and we can get rid of our type definition, and we can then say inject unique, and can't quite do that shortcut in that context, but back to working, and we see that in long form we still have everything working. But of course, reading that I think is much more challenging by coming along and seeing, add inject unique u, where as u : unique, it's like I want a u of type unique, and I'll bring that in, and that's it. So it's a little bit more readable and a little bit less typing. We're actually injecting unique, but we're bringing unique in for type completions. I'm kind of hoping that there ends up being a community-driven shortcut to stop us from having to import these, since we're importing them just for typings. I'd like our tools to be able to figure that out, but it's still early days. Now, that really covers the TypeScript features, but let's look at the build features that we've got here. All it really took to build this is our normal sort of package JSON, which every NPM project typically has, lists out your dependencies. I'm sure most people are probably familiar with that. We have a TypeScript config. There's not a lot to it. We're usually telling our TypeScript config to just exclude node modules and our distribution folder and try and build everything else. And that's great. It just means you can add new files without having to specify them in some sort of manifest or deal with any of that other overhead that was common in older systems.
Yeah, and the tsconfig file is actually quite simpler than it might appear for someone who does not have experience with TypeScript. As a matter of fact, it's just a bunch of options that you can alternatively provide on the command line if you were using the compiler from that. And it also allows you to specify what is the file set of your project, and in this case we use the exclude property, which allows us to define kind of the negative logic, exclude some directories and make sure that everything else is part of our TypeScript project. In this case, we don't want to compile anything in node modules because some of them do ship with TypeScript files in them. We don't want that to be part of our compilation unit as well. So it's a very simple file. Documentation is simple, and it just speeds things up, and it's usually a part of any TypeScript project that's there. So there's nothing, the point I want to get across is there's nothing rocket sciencey about it, essentially.
No, really, I mean, this has just got a few things in it for Angular. I mean, everything else is, it's pretty basic. And I mean, you can see in our book, we actually will walk you through setting one of these up in exactly the bare minimum options you need, which is pretty much next to nothing. Just saying, hey, I want to target ES5 is sort of where you start, and then I think that's even implicit. So that's a simple TypeScript configuration. And we also have a Webpack configuration. And I was mentioning how much shorter it is than Grunt. Now, if you could imagine all of the supporting Grunt tasks and everything you have to bring in to try and replicate this, or even in Gulp, most of this is actually even optional too. There's a lot of nice stuff that I've just added, or that's just been added for this. I mean, the real meat is these couple lines down here where we've specified our loaders. It's going to load TS files, and we've actually specified a linter. And I know both in Grunt and in Gulp, those would be probably quadruple the amount of lines, or at least double, because you have to add function overheads and all of these sort of things to get them going.
Yeah, you would have to do the transpilation, you would have to do the bundling, you would have to do the minification, then you would have to have a linting task. And in this case, we use a plugin which allows us to take out the commonality of our application, like all the third-party libraries, into a separate bundle. So all of that mass would probably result in a big number of Gulp or Grunt scripts or whatnot. And Webpack has been around for quite a bit of time for JavaScript already, and it's a wonderful tool to use, and it's definitely a good answer before we have the Angular CLI kind of ready to be used, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool. This not only does all that automatic dev stuff, but it does bundling. I mean, it's going to take all of your assets and put them into that one minified bundle that you'd like for production. In this case, I've even been able to specify it to give me two bundles, one for my vendor and one for my actual application. So there's a lot of really great stuff out there with respect to tooling for Angular 2 and in any sort of modern framework. And a lot of this has had strong impacts on my workflow. I've been able to, like we mentioned earlier, get my IDE to do a little bit more work for me. And it's true outside of IDEs too, even the more powerful text editors out there, like your Sublimes and your VS Codes and your Atoms and whatnot. I mean, actually we were over there, we were editing in Atom before, and so you can see like all of these tools are available all over the place now, and there's really no reason not to use them. Just take a minute and we'll talk about these decorators that we've seen everywhere. They're a relatively scary feature, at least to me, of Angular 2. I was really excited about the aspect-oriented part of them, which aspect-oriented programming is this sort of paradigm that lets you deal with cross-cutting concerns, like separating view code from logic. Logging is often a common example of a cross-cutting concern. And the idea is that you're going to use these things to improve the flexibility of your code. In the Angular 2 world, most of the time we're using decorators. We're going to be using them as consumers. And that's really good. I mean, if we look back at this little snippet over here on the right, you can see that all of your declarative view information is put up in this at component and separated out from the class. So you're going to be able to write really nice terse classes that don't have a lot of logic to them at all, if any, that still represent your views and still get your things done while separating out those concerns. So again, you're going to be using these as a consumer. I would recommend looking in our book and figuring out how to write them and looking for other information just to really cement that in your head. But if you do get into writing them, you do have to watch out for the pitfalls of aspect-oriented programming. And I mean, this is true in Java and C# and in other languages that have used aspect-oriented approaches to programming before. It's just with great power comes great responsibility. And TypeScript decorators can cause optimization problems if you're writing them yourself. And TypeScript decorators can cause unpredictable states and things to happen in your code that you might not be expecting. One of the nice things about Angular 2 is that as a consumer of these things, you are not really going to have to worry about that. I mean, the Angular 2 team has taken care of making sure that everything is as it should be for you.
Yeah, and I think decorators is actually, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, I think it's an ES7 feature. It's not TypeScript feature, if I'm not mistaken.
It's still a proposal. It's still out there. There's discussions on whether decorators versus annotations, etc. The proposal in ES7, I believe it's in ES7, like you said, is for decorators specifically, and there are actual Angular 2 documents you can find if you go out and Google. I'm sorry I don't have a link prepared for them, but they discuss the subtle differences between annotations and decorators and what that actually means.
Yeah, but it also illustrates like tools like Babel and TypeScript compiler. They actually go a step beyond the ES6, and they're very forward-looking with regards to things that will happen in the ECMAScript standard. Essentially, TypeScript will conform to the ECMAScript. That's the commitment from Microsoft on that end. And I believe Babel is also as well is implementing quite a few ES7 features.
Yeah, they do spread operators on object literals, which is really nice for immutable type designs and whatnot. So again, in lieu of having an Angular 2 CLI to play with, at Rangle we've got an Angular 2 starter package. It's called the Angular 2 Redux Starter. So it actually does make use of sort of the Redux paradigm of data management. And the reason we do that is because this starter is meant to set up a very basic application, but it's very flexible and powerful for writing large scalable applications.
And you don't have to use Redux as well. The application is kept minimal on purpose. It's just a general Angular 2 starter that you could use with whatever.
You don't have to worry about doing your configs or anything like that. They're all built in out of the box. And we also have a book about Angular 2. It's Wrangle's Angular 2 course, and it's available
online, yeah. And the course is actually free. Anyone is welcome to go and read it. We use that as our kind of base material when we teach the course. But nevertheless, it's free material that's available for anyone out there to go and hopefully brush up on some Angular 2 features, and I encourage everyone to go and check it out and hopefully read it and hopefully get something useful out of it as well.
And I mean, we're still in beta, like Angular 2. Angular 2 is still in beta, and we're going to be keeping the book up to date as new changes come out in Angular. So it's really exciting. At this point, we're going to actually get to look at Batarangle, which is a tool that we've been working on with Google, and I'll let Igor take over and explain that to you.
So, Batarangle, let's talk about that here for a few minutes. So, what is Batarangle? Batarangle is an open source effort that we started here at Rangle.io. And the goal of this effort is actually to provide some Chrome DevTools extension for debugging Angular 2 applications. So again, Angular 1 has Batarangle. Other frameworks usually have other tools that aid the debugging of the applications written in them. And we hope that Batarangle will fill the same void in the Angular 2 space as well. Right? So Batarangle is kind of a play on the original Batarang and Rangle.io together. So hate or love it, that's our name. And what we aim to achieve with this tool is we want to help Angular 2 developers to be able to visualize the component tree of their applications and show the data that's associated with each component to aid the debugging and understanding your application structure better as well, right? So again, it's an open source effort, and there is a few ways you can get this. So we have a GitHub repository where you can go and read a lot of documentation about how to build Batarangle, how to get started with it. There is some architecture documentation there as well, contribution guidelines and all that sort of thing. And you can clone the repo, you can build Batarangle from scratch. The instructions are available on the front page of the repository, as well as some other information. But if you just want to try this out, you can go to Batarangle.io, and I will do that momentarily, where we actually are pushing the latest master build. We have a continuous integration set up, and whenever master gets updated, it gets pushed and you can download the packaged extension from the website. We will get it into the Chrome store sometime in the near future, but I'll touch on that when I talk about the future plans. So with that in mind, let's go to Batarangle.io. Again, the website is minimal at this point. It's just essentially a splash page with the link to our GitHub and a big install button that you can use. So you can go again to GitHub, find all the project information available to you, as well as the source code, and essentially anything you need to get started is here. In this case, I'm just gonna download the latest master that we have, and again, it will be in a Chrome store in the near future. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show you how to add Batarangle into your Chrome at the moment before it is in the Chrome store. So it's actually quite an easy step. You can go to your Chrome extensions. Right now I don't have Batarangle, so the way to actually bring it in is by opening it in Finder or in File Explorer if you're in Windows, and essentially drag it into here. So you'll get that pop-up and you can add the extension. And great, now you're good to go. You have Batarangle installed. So now we actually need an Angular 2 application to showcase the features of Batarangle. So we package a Batarangle together with a kitchen sink example. Again, if you clone the repo from GitHub, you'll get access to it as well. And I'm just gonna start it right now so that we have something to play around with. So the application, and again, this uses Webpack, just similarly to what Michael used in his example earlier in the webinar. So we're good, our bundle is valid. Now we should have our application available on localhost 8080. So let's go. Okay, so this is our example application. I'm just gonna close that, and I'm gonna open the DevTools. So one of the things that becomes available once you have Batarangle installed is that you have the Angular 2 tab in your Chrome DevTools extension. If you go here, you get to see what Batarangle is. The feature that is kind of apparent on the first glance is the component tree of your application. So this kind of gives you like somewhat of a bird's eye view of how your application is structured. And you can click specific components and you can see some data associated with them, like the Angular 2 inputs and outputs. In this case, there's only inputs for that component. And importantly, you also have something that's called state here. So what this is essentially it shows you all the instance variables or properties of your component object at runtime. This could be your own properties for your own application, as well as, in this case, since ng class is a built-in Angular 2 component, you see some of the internal stuff associated with the component. And this one is not much. Another thing is, obviously, again, we get the updates. So right now we see that this ng class has an applied property which is active at the moment. The other ones do not. And again, if I switch and I select a different component, I see that this one has changed to active instead. Right, so that's again one of the simple features. Another one is that we can essentially go over and get some kind of hover over the component, so we get this kind of nice boundary selection. It's a bit not perfect at the moment, but we're working to make it better. So in this case, we see what's our ng class kind of relates to on the screen as well, right? Another little feature is the search. So in this case, I'm going to search for a component that contains the word outlet, and that selects that component for me and updates the property tab with it right away. So let's try this on some of the features of our application. So I showcased switching to different routes here as well. And the important thing is also we have that router outlet component here. So again, if I switch, that gets updated, and now my router outlet is showing a control form component as opposed to a home component that it showed before, right? Again, we get the same updates. So in this case, we have ABC123 in one of our inputs, and we see our ng form model pointing, showing ABC123, as well as the specific form control showing ABC123. I'm going to go here and I'm going to change this to QWERTY, and I'm going to tab out, and now this has updated to show QWERTY as well. And again, we can click on select the ng form model, and we can see some of the state that's associated with it, as well as inputs and outputs and whatnot. Another interesting example, I guess, to see is how it helps you already to kind of see where your routing is going in your application. So when I go to the router sub-application that we have here, I see that my router outlet has loaded the start main component, and I can switch this to start child, and I see that this reloaded with the start child component. And again, this is the access to that same start child component, which has no state and has very minimal things associated with it. Another important feature is dynamic control tab here, and what this deals with is a part of Angular 2 framework that's called dynamic component loader. So for those of you who don't know, dynamic component loader allows you to decide which component to load where at runtime, right? Essentially, you can load like anything into anything, and we can see here that now our router outlet shows the dynamic controls route component. And we have here, nothing is loaded, right? We just have those, load into sections here. So I'm going to go and I'm going to attempt to load one of the components using dynamic component loader. I'm going to click here. So this is the dynamically loaded component, and we can see it displayed here. Now, all of a sudden, this has loaded the hello component. Also, this is a way to kind of understand what is happening in the framework at a slightly deeper level, because we can see that now that we loaded hello and we use the dynamic component loader, the framework actually wraps it in the dynamic component and you can kind of gauge some of the things that happen in the framework. It's useful to look at things like ngIfs and ngFors and kind of learn a little bit more about those. Now, one last little feature that's probably worth it that we've added is actually that you can drill down to the specific HTML of the component by double-clicking it, and this will bring you to your beloved and familiar Elements tab that you have, so you can jump quickly back and forth between those. Also, what we've added is another little feature where you can go into the console, and you have an object that's called $A. So $A will correspond to the latest component that has been selected, and when you click it, you actually see a debug element object. So this is the internal Angular 2 object which we get from the framework when we parse the application, and this is where we get the rest of our information that we display here. And this information is accessible to you on the console. In case there is something that we might not be showing in the properties yet, you can access it by using $A, right? And it's quite good. And again, you get the usual out-of-the-box Chrome auto-completion tools in here, and you'll see some of the specific attributes that are specific to debug element, like native element or native node and some other things there. So this is essentially the feature set of Batarangle. And again, you can get it at Batarangle.io, or you can go to the GitHub repo and get some additional documentation or build it following our instructions on your own and bring it into Chrome. Those are the two places that you can go to get some additional information on that. Now, I've mentioned that Batarangle is an open source effort, and contributions are very, very welcome from anyone. We're open for anyone in the community to come in and contribute in any shape or form that they deem available to them. But the way to get started with that is to join our Slack channel. The link to it is in our GitHub repo. Essentially, you fill in a simple form, we add you to our Slack channel, and this way you can keep track of updates, like what are the latest PRs, what are the issues that were created, which builds were run through the continuous integration process that we set up, as well as ask us questions or get help if you run into issues using Batarangle, and you might, because it is still in developer preview. You're more than welcome to ask us questions on Slack. So that's the way to get started if you want to contribute, is again to join our Slack channel and to get the conversation going. But I would also suggest to read our contribution guidelines as well as some of the architecture documentation that we have available. But again, I want to stress this out, that any kind of contribution is welcome. Feedback, questions, issues that were opened, and of course PRs. And in general, we're open to the community providing ideas to us. So now, let's talk about the future plans here for a second. So as I mentioned, Batarangle is in developer preview. We currently work with beta 3. Batarangle is itself an Angular 2 application, which has been updated to beta 3. So as long as your application is in beta 3, you should be able to use Batarangle. You should not have to make any code modifications. It should work out of the box with your application. The only requirement is that your application runs in the dev mode, in the Angular 2 dev mode, which I believe is the default when you run the Angular 2 application anyway. So again, it should work out of the box. If you have any issues, you're more than welcome to ask us for any help. And just to end with the note, we are working towards the Batarangle beta, which we are hoping to have in several weeks or in the near future. And at this point, we'll put it on the Chrome store, and I'll make it more generally available as well. Again, we just want to sort out some little issues with user experience, as well as address some performance issues. Batarangle works great with small applications as well as medium-sized application. I think we need to make a few performance improvements for very, very large applications with a lot of components. But general Angular 2 user today should not necessarily encounter that anyway. So with that in mind, me and Michael both want to thank you very much for joining our webinar. And again, check out Batarangle.io, check out our Angular 2 Redux starter if you want to start writing Angular 2 applications, and of course check out the NG course at Rangle.io to learn more about the Angular 2. And those are our GitHub handles. And I think with that in mind, me and Michael will answer some of the questions that you might have.
Yeah, so the webinar software we're using, the Citrix program, it should actually have on it a little question section. So if you want to start filling that in with your questions, we'd be happy to help answer them.
I see a few questions.
Oh, great. So
I think we can just click the...
All right. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, we just had a joke about the GitHub family, which is kind of funny because we were laughing about our slides earlier and how it looks like we're the GitHub brothers.
Yeah.
So that's...
I think we should use that internally, yeah.
Okay, so we've got a couple different jokes about that, which is great.
Can we use Polymer with Angular 2? Wow, that's a good question. I have never personally tried it. I don't know if you have, Michael, but I think that Angular 2 in many ways supersedes Polymer and kind of makes you not want to use it if you're writing it in Angular 2. That's the general impression that I think I have. I think Angular 2 offers a stronger offering if you want to write something that is web component-like.
I do know that the Angular 2 team did take web components very seriously into consideration when they were writing it. I don't have first-hand experience to answer that, I'm sorry to say, but I would expect that the Angular 2 core team will actually have some information on that, hopefully in the near future.
I think Polymer is more closely aligned with the web component standards than Angular 2, but Angular 2 is very strong about going in that direction and is just more feature-rich than Polymer.
So we got a question from Mosh about noticing that we didn't specify providers when we were doing DI. How does that work? So I'll just take a quick minute to try and answer that. In Angular 2, they've really revamped the dependency injection system. And in our book, there's a whole bunch of detail on how that works. But I think very quickly I can hopefully answer that. In this bootstrap here, where we start our Angular 2 application, I've put this array here. So example root is the root component of the app, and every Angular 2 application starts with like a root component. And then after that is an array of providers. And I've actually put the class name directly into this array, which is one way of doing it. And there are more ways, which unfortunately we won't be able to get into the second, but that's where it's provided. And you can actually provide dependencies on individual components, but there are some tricks to that, so you're going to want to check out the documentation for that.
Gulp or Grunt, which one is best for Angular 2? Do you mind if I answer that?
No, go right ahead.
So from our experience, we played with a few different tools. I mean, I think Grunt is probably out of the question at this point. I think Gulp is something that is a valid offering. Usually you would end up using Gulp when you work with something like maybe System.js, unless you're using GSPM. But general Webpack is a much solid answer at this point, in my opinion, from using Angular 2. I had the most success using with Webpack in terms of giving me trouble or issues. I had less success with System.js or GSPM approach. But nevertheless, we feel like Webpack is a better offering for Angular 2 at the moment. There is some use for Gulp, especially when it comes to writing some scripts. We found the biggest use case for a situation where we want to write a platform-independent script. Like in some cases, we run our WebDriver setup using Gulp just because it's easier and it works on multiple platforms as opposed to us writing shell scripts for Windows or Linux or Mac OS, and so to speak. So.
Yeah, I was actually just going to try and echo that because the testing has been a case where Gulp has actually come in handy, but for most things, I've been really, really happy with Webpack. And this leads into the next question we have, which is please share your views on JSPM as a replacement for dependency management. And I know Igor has some thoughts on that. I'll just get mine out of the way first. But I don't have a whole lot of experience with JSPM and System.js. I do really like where they're trying to go with it. And the whole solving the module loader issue thing is really quite wonderful. But I like to hack a lot in my free time, and JSPM has really cost me a lot of free time on the weekends when I've been trying to put together, toy apps and side projects and such. And I've just, between JSPM and trying to use other different disparate tools like Light Server, I've had so many weird little issues that, especially with TypeScript, that it's just not for me at this stage. I like to think they'll mature over time and it'll be better, but that's just my thoughts on it. I don't know about you, Igor.
Yeah, I share basically the same sentiment as yourself, and what I found is JSPM has a much better offering if you are writing in ES6. It has some quirks while working with TypeScript. It's possible to set it up to work with TypeScript. It just takes a bit more effort, and what I think JSPM might have a better story for like asynchronous module loading or something along those lines, as well as conforming better with the ES6 specification for module loading. But again, ultimately Webpack works perfect for us, and we prefer that at this point, and I'm curious to see where JSPM will go in the future as well. Does Angular 2 have reliable hot reloading yet? That's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer that question well, so I would look into that a bit more, but I didn't focus on that aspect of it, so I'm not sure. Do you know anything about that, Michael?
I'm actually not even 100% sure on what Adrian actually means by hot reloading. I've heard it used in a couple different contexts. I've heard it used for, like, you have your running application, then it hot loads modules on the fly, and I've also heard it in conjunction with build tools where they would like hot reload only certain aspects of your code. So, and on both of those fronts, I am unfortunately not well informed. So
yeah, I mean, if you mean hot reloading in a sense like Redux does it, where it reloads your code and like you can keep some of that application state that you had before, I don't know of any good story yet. I remember reading a blog or two about that. But it was at the very early stages of playing around with it. So
okay. Sorry to cut you off.
No,
I didn't mean to
that's
interrupt there. There's a bunch of questions about our book, and you can actually get that by going to ngcourse.rangle.io, and I've just sent it to all in the answers there. It is a book that we've been working on for the last little while, and we're going to keep it up to date, and it has tons and tons of information about Angular 2 in there, including some stuff that you probably have to dig through the source code to find.
Yeah, we use that book for our training. The only difference is that when we do training, we also do workshops, depending on the training length, and some other live coding exercises, which are not part of the book yet. But it's a great source of material that even I myself read sometimes just to see like what guys have come up with there.
So we've got a question about the production readiness of Angular 2 and if it's ready for a production environment. And I think each individual business probably has to answer that question on their own, but I can say that we have had some experience with other companies who have been running Angular since even alpha in production, which is, I think that's a little bit aggressive, but it's in beta now and it's out there, and the applications we've seen have been quite stable so far. So, and we also know that internally Google has actually been using Angular 2 for various projects, and that's how we got some of the NG upgrade info, is because they've been dealing with that on their own. So I do think it is a case-by-case basis. It really depends on what you're running. I mean, if you're a bank, you might want to hold off, but if you're more of a cutting-edge startup, you definitely want to go Angular 2.
Yeah, and it might not be ideal at the moment. There's like Beta 3 has some minification issues, for example, but we are using Angular 2 in enterprise environments as well. It's still a little bit more on the adventurous side, but at the same time we have the likes of Google and Microsoft, so to speak, with TypeScript kind of backing this. So even though it's in Beta 3, and if you're looking to write a production-ready code, I would kind of lean towards probably using Angular 2 at this point as well, keeping an eye to the fact that it will probably be released in the final form, not in beta form, hopefully this year. So
we got a question about UI frameworks. I believe, is that where material comes into play?
Yeah, I mean, I know that the Angular material, there is an effort to bring Angular 2 material into Angular 2. I don't know, last time I looked, which was I think 2-3 months ago, it was still a bit fresh. It's possible to use to an extent. So I think that's where it stood, at least from 2-3 months ago. It probably improved since. In terms of a good UI framework, this is not necessarily my specialty, but what I've been told to use by people in our company who know what they're talking about is base CSS. And that's what I've been using in my apps for the most part. Sometimes people use Bootstrap and so on, but I think the general preference from our designers is Bootstrap CSS. I'm not sure I'm qualified to say why, but they told me, and I think that's probably a good answer.
So we've got a couple of different questions about hooking into jQuery and the DOM and things like that, and those are actually questions we were trying to answer yesterday. We've been really avoiding DOM manipulation ourselves, so we do want to find an answer to this, and I'm sorry we don't have one at the moment, but it's just most of the Angular 2 stuff we've been kind of worried about is writing a sort of generic shadow DOM style Angular 2 that is independent of the DOM, and once we start changing the DOM or working with jQuery, we lose that flexibility. So it hasn't been something we've really explored yet. Maybe Igor has something to add to that. I don't know.
I think the general preference with Angular 2 is to avoid DOM manipulation. And one of the reasons for that is that with things like native script, we're probably going to be writing multi-platform Angular 2 applications where we don't necessarily will have DOM, so to speak, as well as it will limit use of web workers as well if you have DOM manipulation. So if you can avoid it, by all means, try to.
But we do know that that's really going to be a hot question for certain people and certain businesses. So we are going to try and get an answer to that, but unfortunately at the moment we don't have one.
Yeah, so the question is, can Batarangle help with debugging RxJS observables and promises? So the short answer is yes. It can display your observables, but it can display the same information that maybe you would get through a debugger or the console log. You just might have a reference to that object, that observable object or a promise available to you in the Batarangle view. Whatever properties are associated with it at runtime, you can inspect them just like you would in a debugger, essentially. So let's look. What's this one? The second last. Allow JavaScript code to... Oh, that's you want to answer that, Michael?
Yeah, actually. So there's a question from Oscar about how he had read that the latest version of TypeScript allows JavaScript code to coexist with TypeScript code. So that's interesting, because JavaScript code could always coexist with TypeScript code. It's just you had to use type definition files to actually get typings for it. And I believe that's still true, but what is the capability they did add in 1.8 is that TypeScript will transpile sort of superset JavaScript code from, say, ES6, as well as transpiling from TypeScript. So you can actually have TypeScript and JavaScript files side by side, and get it to actually take ES6 and transpile it down, which you couldn't do before.
Yeah, but I think it's probably an issue of extensions of GS versus TS and having both in your project, right? But I think the important thing to take away from this is that any JavaScript code is valid TypeScript code, right? I mean, again, like you've seen, TypeScript still produces output by default, even if you have compile time errors. But again, if you put untyped JavaScript code in your TS file, you're good to go. It's a valid TypeScript. They're conforming to each other.
Okay, so there's a question about TypeScript decorators and if they're required for Angular 2 and if Babel has decorators. I think there is up-and-coming support for decorators in Babel, but it's not quite as advanced as the TypeScript decorator support, and that's partially because I don't know if anybody remembers, but about a year ago there was an announcement from Google that they were going to make their own superset of JavaScript called @script, which was actually going to be a superset of TypeScript. And fortunately for everybody, the Google team just ended up working with the TypeScript team, so now we have one less competing standard out there. And more specifically, though, do you have to use decorators? Well, no. There is actually means of writing Angular 2 code in pure ES5 without decorators. And the Angular 2 exposes an API for that, which I don't actually know off the top of my head. But it is definitely possible. I've seen more and more blog posts in my RSS feeds about that subject recently and about how to write ES5 style Angular 2. It's just that personally I've found it so much more pleasant to work with TypeScript and modules that I haven't really explored that area yet.
Yeah, I think using ES5 with Angular 2 is kind of only applicable if you're into masochism, to be honest with you.
That seems to be what I've seen from bloggers as well.
Is jQuery supported in Angular 2? I don't believe it is. You could use jQuery with Angular 2, but again, I would stay away from DOM manipulation as much as possible.
And then the NG2 bare bones. No, I actually don't have that in GitHub yet. I just sort of made that kind of ad hoc for this, but I would be happy to put it up into GitHub. I can do so. It's just that we're using our own Rangle starters, so I didn't really want to get in the way of that because they're a little bit more comprehensive. This bare bones is basically a playground that's just done in Webpack. I mean, it's not really any different than what you get in the actual Angular 2 handbook when you walk through that Superheroes course. It's just instead of using System.js, this uses Webpack.
Yeah, I would suggest you start looking at the Angular 2 Redux start that we have in place. It takes care of more than just bare bones application, but probably combining that with Webpack documentation or the documentation in our NG course too. You can probably strip, if you just want a simple playground, you can strip things out of it. You'll probably get more value by looking at the Angular 2 starter, essentially.
Yeah, the full starter has, it takes into account things like bringing in third-party typings and testing and all sorts of things you'd actually want for something you really want to actually play with.
Absolutely.
So. All right, well, we're out of time, but thank you guys very much for tuning in. And we have one more webinar in this series, and it's on, I think, the 24th. But just confirm that, yes, it is on the 24th. So anyway, thanks for joining us, and have a great day.
Thanks for listening to GitHub Brothers.